Hi, I'm Pastor Andrew from Grace Point Church in Biddeford, Maine. And certainly our Maine community this last week was just rocked by the shootings and the killings and those who were wounded, the devastation, the physical devastation from that. Additionally, I think as a result of that, there was just a general lack of safety felt throughout Maine, and maybe even spreading further than that. Maine, we generally are here because it's a quiet place, and you may or may not talk to your neighbors on a regular basis, but you definitely watch your back. Generally, we feel pretty safe and secure in Maine, and so something like this really has an effect. And I know there's places all around the world that is not, what we take for granted in Maine is not experienced on a daily basis. But here in Maine, there was maybe a loss of innocence to a certain degree. One of the terms that kept coming up is sort of that this was unimaginable or unthinkable. Certainly, we don't want to imagine things like this. We don't want to imagine that someone is capable of committing this level of violence against others. We don't want to think that it could happen to us in the place that we live. But I think if you look at world history, unfortunately, you see regular patterns of people committing great acts of violence against others. When we throw off the value that God has put in each human being as He created them, as we ignore the laws of God, as we say continually yes to our evil desires, things that we wish were only unimaginable become very, very real. And so I think what we get to experience as a community, some of us more directly than others, is that sin has a very real and very devastating effect. That violating the law of God to love your neighbor as yourself has very, very real consequences. And there are families that will forever grieve what has happened this last week. Now, those of us who maybe spared the direct effect, we have a responsibility to mourn with those who mourn, to help in whatever way we can. But I think it's good for us to pause for a brief moment and to just acknowledge that violating God's laws have very real consequences. And we don't like that, we don't enjoy that, but yet sin and Satan want to bring destruction. And unfortunately, Maine has experienced that this last week. Second piece that I just would like to observe is that there were many stories, both among those who are victims and from the law enforcement, of many people who stepped up in strength. They sacrificed themselves for the good of others, for the protection of others. They left the safety of their own families. I happened to be at a law enforcement establishment right as everything went down, and seeing squad cars just peeling out of there, heading towards what they knew was a danger, and knowing that they had their own wives and kids and family and mothers and fathers there in the safety of their homes, and yet they're heading straight towards perceived and real danger, not knowing how that would end for them. And yet they did so. They used the training that they had and the resources they had and the strength they had, and they risked themselves to protect others. And what a beautiful picture, I think, of the gospel is that we see stories of like this, that ultimately it's a small picture of that ultimate sacrifice that Jesus made on our account. That instead of running away from the danger that we caused and the sin and the devastation that we caused, that Jesus ran towards that danger and put Himself in place of the punishment that we deserved. And so what is just a beautiful picture of the gospel that is seen here. It's just something that's so marvelous to experience. Maybe just a quick third observation is, as the innocence and as the uncertainty of this unfolded, there was not an immediate resolution. There wasn't an immediate answer. There was days of uncertainty, days of fear, days of anxiousness. And we in Maine don't often live like that. We live in Maine, I mean, even during isolation, we kind of live in somewhat isolation. Our big cities are not that big. And yet, in the midst of this, I think it's a good opportunity for us to remember that we don't live in fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear. Well, how can we not fear while situations of life are truly traumatic, are truly challenging, are truly awful? awful? How do people in places that experience this on a regular and ongoing basis, even around the world right now, how are they expected to live without fear? Well, certainly there's circumstances that are out of our control. There were answers that we did not have. There were solutions that we could not provide. Even all the attention of all the government agencies and all the people couldn't bring an immediate resolution to this. And so fear builds. And we as followers of Jesus, we're told in scriptures that we're not just supposed to muster up courage. Courage isn't something of the absence of fear. But in fact, courage is acknowledging the uncertainty and that yet recognizing that we don't have to fear because God's with us. Although we don't have control of the circumstances, although we don't know all things, although we don't have the ability to control all the details that we would love to control, that we can live courageously despite the fear because God is with us. Because his presence is always surrounding us. Now, this does not mean that we don't take appropriate caution. This does not mean that we don't listen to law enforcement, the officials that are trying to manage the situation. But it does mean that fear doesn't have to grip our hearts and our souls. That we can live in confidence and in the peace and the love of Jesus because we know he's never left us. He's not abandoned us. We're not on our own. Because yes, in those moments we realize our resources are woefully inadequate. But we also realize that the presence of God is with us. If you're interested in talking further about this, I would love to connect with you on it. Just the opportunity. Maybe for you, it's you live in fear because you've never known the God that walks with you. God with us. And I'd love to introduce you to him. Maybe today it's an opportunity to give thanks for those who risked their lives, their own families, their safety for our protection. Maybe it's just coming to grips with yes, sin does have real consequences. But I hope the events of this last week aren't just a passing news story, but that there's something that can bring our hearts closer to God and closer to a correct understanding of humanity outside and also the humanity within. God bless. Love you guys.